this notion of black as a political identity. And then more recently, still on the global level, when you look at the resistance to neoliberal policies, which was taking place across, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa in the 80s, you get organizations like the World Bank coming up with this very racialized discourse about corruption and good governance, saying that Africa is somehow inherently corrupt, and that's why we need to be much more involved in day-to-day governance to sort of bring in good governance and so on. We have to be right there in every single policy meeting of those governments. There'll be an IMF advisor telling people how those policies should be framed. Now coming into the question of the Ghadar movement, which is one of the reasons we're here today. I think there's very direct parallels with what's going on now, and one of the things that really struck me has been the parallel with the kind of strategies of repression which are going on now. Hundreds and hundreds of the Ghadar rebels were incarcerated in the Andamans in a British prison on those islands, which was really very much like a concentration camp. They were tortured there, many were executed there, and there were ongoing hunger strikes and so on. And so we don't have to look very far to see the parallels with what's happening now in terms of the so-called war on terror, with Guantanamo, with the experiences of people like Talha Hassan, who's been extradited and is being held in solitary in a supermax prison in the US. Similarly, after the 1857 uprisings, the British undertook what they called collective punishment, where whole villages would be, the people would be executed, there were mass rapes of women and so on. So this idea that, it's actually, when you're facing resistance to imperialism, the answer is random collective punishment. We're seeing the same thing with the drones in Pakistan, as Naeem has said. And now, in a way, Ghadar was one of the key sort of questions, as has been said, was the challenge to racist immigration laws. But they link together the questions around migration, the broader questions around imperialism and its relationship to racism, which they faced on the day-to-day level. And this is, of course, a continuing strand for movements of anti-imperialist solidarity, like the ones which people have talked about, like the ones the AYMs were involved with, and some of the ones which are still going on today. But I think it's especially important to think about that kind of connection being made by communities which have migrated, or whose parents and grandparents have migrated. It's especially important to think of it now because the British state, the US state, are very involved now in this idea of involving diasporas in development, right? And they're doing this through, particularly DFID is very engaged in this idea. And I've talked about this in my book, but I think clearly what we have to understand is that it is very much about, using these groups to kind of give this very kind of authentic face to what's still very much an imperialist project, right? And it's also got this very underlying idea of civilizing the natives all over again, but this time through these people who are settled in the West and are therefore supposed to be kind of already civilized. And this is particularly in the context of the war on terror. For example, there was a recent report about the Pakistani diaspora in Europe and its impact on democracy building in Pakistan. And just to quote from this report, it says that diaspora members have a lot to contribute as they have seen how democracy and democratic institutions work. Right? What they've seen of it, we know. But anyway. And of course, the diaspora involvement in Pakistan, being promoted by the British government at the moment, is explicitly related to what they call de-radicalization through organizations like the Quilliam Foundation and others. And it's part of a sort of bigger strategy which both Britain and the US in particular are pursuing at the moment, where they want to incorporate diaspora organizations into broader economic, political, and of course strategic objectives. So I just want to quote to you from the former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who has explicitly described diasporas as the core of smart power for the US, right? And she made a speech a couple of years ago to launch as something called the International Diaspora Engagement Alliance in America, which is aimed to bring diaspora communities into the fold of US foreign policy and development. And then what she said in this speech, I'll just very briefly quote to you. She said, because of your familiarity with cultural norms, your own motivations, your own special skills and leadership, you are frankly our Peace Corps, our USAID, our State Department, all rolled into one. Yes, we have a very strong force in our organized diplomatic efforts, our development professionals, and certainly our defense establishment. But I think building these coalitions and using people-to-people exchanges is actually the core of smart power. And that's where all of you come in. So she's talking to the diaspora troops, right? So now in Britain, it's interesting to look at the way DFID has tried to engage diaspora groups relating to India in particular. Because this is very much focused on promoting Hindu right-wing, Hindutva, pro-Hindutva organizations, like for example an organization called Hindu Aid, which got a huge grant in 2006 from DFID, supposedly to teach children and young people about development, right? And this is linked to the Hindu Forum of Britain, which is one of the organizations which represents the Hindu supremacist parties, network of parties in India. So what is this development that these organizations and DFID are such suitable partners with each other for? What kind of development are they really talking about? Well, of course we know the kinds of neoliberal policies that have been promoted by DFID across the world, and we know also basically they're quite similar to what we're experiencing here in many ways in terms of huge cutbacks in whatever kind of social provision there was in terms of education, in terms of health, and huge massive inequalities growing and a kind of real entrenchment of very deep poverty. But for South Asia, as well as for many other parts of the global South, a huge aspect of this, and this is something that Naeem has mentioned, is this new phase of land grabbing by corporate capital, right? Something which some people have called accumulation by dispossession. And it takes all kinds of forms. It's corporates taking over land, usually land where, very fertile land where food could be grown, being taken over for mining, or it could be for special economic zones where basically the corporates, both Indian multinationals and foreign multinationals, become more or less the de facto government in that area. It could be to be sold off as real estate. It could be for factories where there'll be labor laws won't even be applicable. So on many different levels, and using, interestingly, the same colonial laws about land acquisition, this land is being taken over. And all of the mainstream parties have shared these neoliberal policies, which makes it possible. But in India in particular, there's a particular relationship which the Hindu right-wing parties have with the corporates. And I think this is most obvious in the context of Gujarat state in India, which has been ruled by the BJP and by Narendra Modi since 2001. Because Narendra Modi, as I'm sure you know, is now the prime ministerial candidate. In 2002, he presided over the genocidal attacks on the minority Muslim community in Gujarat. And there's, a huge amount of evidence to prove that it was actually state-sponsored and specifically engineered by Modi. But this hasn't stood in his way from projecting himself as a so-called Vikas Purush, or man of development. And the kinds of development which he's so proud of in Gujarat, well, they involve huge swathes of the land and the coastline being converted into special economic zones, or what are now called special investment regions, and handed over to corporates which are heavily subsidized by the state. So what this means is that although Gujarat has a relatively high level of economic growth, it's now one of the states with the highest incidence of child malnutrition in the whole of India. Recently, even official figures showed that 44.6% of children under 5 are malnourished in Gujarat, which are figures which can only be compared to the poorest states in India. But yet this is being held up as a model of development which the rest of the country should follow. And as a result of this model, the BJP is now the ruling party of choice for huge sections of Indian and transnational corporate capital. So even before Modi announced his running for prime ministerial candidate, and still having indictments against him for the 2002 genocide, he'd already been endorsed as the best person for the job by the leading corporate billionaires in India, including Ratan Tata, Mukesh Ambani, and Sunil Mittal, who claimed that Modi was the CEO of Gujarat and he could also run the nation along the same lines, right? But once again, just as in 1857 and just as in the time of Ghadar, there's of course a huge amount of resistance to these corporate attacks on people's basic livelihood. One example which we've been involved in is the case of Vedanta. Now, Vedanta is actually a British company listed on the UK Stock Exchange, and it's run by Anil Agarwal, who is known as the 17th richest man in this country. He has been, feted by David Cameron on David Cameron's last visit to India. He made special mention of push Vedanta's interests. And it's an aluminium mining company which has sought, in particular, to destroy the environment where a particular Adivasi group had their home and destroy their livelihood. They're called the Dongra Khons, and they have organized over many, many years resisting this, and particularly in defense of a mountain called Niyamgiri, which is kind of sacred to them, but which is also the basic source of their livelihood and survival. And they have a whole history of resisting the colonial state and subsequently the post-independence Indian state. And recently, they actually had a victory where they managed to, despite huge amount of intimidation, the police, being, of course, on the side of the company, and the company paying people to threaten them in all kinds of ways. Despite that, the people of this region unanimously rejected Vedanta and said that they refused, because basically what happened was that the government was forced to hold local level a referendum on it locally, and there was a unanimous rejection of this. But the struggle is still ongoing because there's no guarantee that the state will actually keep its promise to listen to what people have said. And so, international solidarity becomes very important with this kind of content, getting this known, and not simply leaving it to NGOs like Survival International, which will simply talk about this tribe which is, so primitive and needs protection from people, in Britain. Not that kind of colonial narrative which doesn't actually recognize the political struggle waged by these people, and which doesn't recognize their own representatives which they have chosen. I'm not going to go on for much longer because I know we are getting short of time. But one other thing I wanted to mention was the case of Soni Sori, which I'm sure some of you know about. Soni Sori is again an Adivasi woman descendant in Chhattisgarh, who has been, she's a school teacher and she has been in jail for over 2 years now. Precisely because she had the courage to speak out against the corporates which have really waged war on the people of that region. And they have their paid armed gangs who have terrorized people, who have made people leave their villages in their thousands, who have committed hundreds and hundreds of rapes. And she spoke out against this, she spoke out against the police. And as a result, she has been imprisoned and she's been tortured, and she's been sexually tortured in horrific ways. And what is particularly kind of disturbing and almost surreal about this is that the police superintendent who actually supervised and ordered her torture was given an award by the president last Republic Day, and this award was actually for gallantry, right? So this is the kind of way in which the Indian state operates, and of course we know how this kind of torture, imprisonment, and rape has been, a weapon against the people of Kashmir, against the people of Manipur, against Dalit communities fighting for justice across the country, and so on. So just in conclusion, we in South Asian Solidarity Group have been campaigning on a lot of these issues, but always seeking to kind of bring them together with the kind of questions which we're facing in this country. And I think recently it was quite, something which happened quite recently was that an MP in London, the MP from Brent North, he's a Labour MP, Barry Gardiner. As you may know, he actually invited Narendra Modi over to this country. He's the chair of an organization called the Labour Friends of India, which has this very close relationship with the Hindu right and with the BJP and with Modi. And there was a huge protest outside Barry Gardiner's surgery last month, which brought together people from all different South Asian communities, as well as others. And so it was the kind of action which hopefully is going to continue and is going to be consolidated. And this kind of meeting is I think part of that process. So thank you very much.
Before we open the floor for contributions from AYM members and also then the Q&A session, we're going to be circulating a cup for contributions, donations for today, for us and all of the costs and everything. Yeah, sure. Okay, so we sort of said we wanted to hear from people who are actually involved in the AYM first, and then, sorry, it's a bit disjointed, but we're trying to cover a lot of territory today. Do you want me to sit here? Yeah. There might be questions maybe.
Welcome to your
Okay, so is there anyone who would like to speak about your reflections on?
Yeah.
I'll take you on.
I think very rarely they mentioned
three things which is enshrined constitution of Ghadar Party: equality, casteless, religiousless. Because they have learned after 57, when the British rulers used that three things against society. So very rarely anyone mentioned about that. I mean, this is the important thing for Ghadar Party, because even first president, he brought Lala Hardayal from Harvard University, and Lala Hardayal wrote many books about religion and caste and things. He said Indian society is holding back that kind of thing. But we never mention that kind of thing when we are talking about Ghadar Party. I think if anybody harboring these kind of things now, they are not respecting Ghadar Party and appreciating Ghadar Party's things.
So we
Second
actually,
question.
Hold on one point. We actually want AYM contributions at this moment. You can talk about that later on. Is the second point to do with? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
When she mentioned about Indian Workers Association, their loyalty to back to India, it's not. Indian Workers Association, for the time being now, not affiliated anything. Even Indian Workers Association had brought Michael X, and we have a pledge there now, only 50%. We support every progressive movement anywhere, like Vietnam, South Africa, Angola, everything. Irish struggle, Palestine struggle. So when you mentioning that kind of one, of course there will be maybe individual member of Indian Workers who have some kind of affiliation over there. But of course, I thinking is Naxalwadi and Maoist is doing a good thing. So it doesn't mean I'm a Indian Workers Association affiliate that. So I didn't like that.
It was in the origin of the IWA, maybe not now, but certainly.
No, not never. Because I'm a member for many decades, never affiliated to anybody.
It's a pleasure hearing your talk. I was wondering, you mentioned the different types of racisms. What about the Islamophobia? I mean, what about the Islamophobia of the left? Certain sections of the left are quite Islamophobic, and I've noticed a streak of white supremacism on the left, and also their Eurocentrism, as I feel like they try to colonize Asian groups, movements.
I think I just wanted to say that I think we need.
This was a question directed at them.
Yeah, I know. Before we move on to the Q&A thing, I think we need to hear from some of the people who are members of the AYM.
We want to hear specific contributions.
They will answer that.
Yes.
Yeah.
They will answer.
We'll point at you then. How's that?
I'd just like to start by congratulating Anandi and Kalpana on documenting the history of the Asian youth movement. I think it's something which has been wanting for a long time, and I think she's also been working, I know, for many years in trying to put this book together, and it's an excellent publication, and I would encourage everybody to actually read it. I was a member of the Asian youth movement in Sheffield for a number of years, and there are many of my colleagues who are also members of Asian youth movement in Sheffield, and I know also in Birmingham and some other locations also around here. I think what I want to share is maybe not my own personal story, but maybe share a few aspects which I think the Asian youth movement did contribute, which Anandi did highlight, but maybe I highlighted it in a personal sense as well. Clearly, many of the Asian youth movements, all in fact of the Asian youth movements, had a very strong anti-imperialist perspective, and they brought that in any of its political actions, in any of its organizations, in any of its activities they actually did, and this was shown in many different ways as well. Three things. One, which I think back and when I look at what some of us did. One was education. It was actually essential for members of the Asian youth movement to actually take a lead to make sure that they actually educated themselves. We held weekend sessions where we actually went away and we studied history and we asked each other questions with regards to our histories, the history of the black communities in the UK, the histories of communities in countries where we came from, in North America, and so on as well. And it was critical that we actually understood these in the activities that we also organized. I mean, I still reflect back at the weekend schools that we actually had. I also still reflect back at when from Sheffield we used to travel to Manchester and have discussions with our colleagues in Manchester as well with regards to the activities that they are organizing, why they're organizing, and so on and so forth. Another area, and this is something which Anandi did bring up, is it was very important for us to actually draw the links with other struggles that are happening internationally as well. Anandi mentioned the support for the Republican movement in North of Ireland. And we organized trips for people to go over. We encouraged our younger youth movement members to make sure that they were also able to go over. I mean, I remember when I first went over to Belfast, my very first trip to Ireland many years ago, and this was when the Sinn Féin were doing some huge demonstrations, and there was also a NORAD delegation. Some of you may remember NORAD, some of you may not remember NORAD right now, from North America when they came over. And there was a lot of collateral, and there were plastic bullets going on there. For me, it was a pretty frightening experience, but it was nevertheless an experience. We also visited many of the Sinn Féin shops there. We also went for education lessons there, and we learned. We learned from how people organized, how people agitated, and how people drew up various different strategies as well. And we brought this back to our own communities as well. I think if you look at some of the posters behind yourselves and at the side of yourselves, you can see that all the things that Mukhtar did in terms of actually putting our struggles together with Palestine, putting our struggles together with the Irish struggle, we made sure that there were links between them as well. I think the third thing which comes to my mind, and I'll keep quiet after that, is we wanted to make sure that we actually did have a movement. I think, Anandi did not mention this, but I think it did come across in her book, where attempts were made, a few attempts were made to say, we've got a whole bunch of different youth movements in different parts of the UK, how could we actually make sure that we form strong links with them? How could we make sure, and there were we made sure that Sheffield actually had links with Bradford, with Manchester, and London, and that whenever there was an issue, whenever there was a campaign, we could actually harness this movement to actually move forward. It was a digital activity. A lot of our activities were localized within where we were, and a lot of the youth were also growing up just like me, with becoming added other responsibilities and so on and so forth. Finally, I think this in conclusion, it was, I can relate to the quote which Gareth Pierce did. I think it was an extremely happy time for us. It was, young people with lots of fire in their bellies, young people with huge camaraderie in terms of what they wanted to do and in terms of wanting to achieve things as well. And this carries on. We're talking the late 70s, the early 80s, and now we are in 2013, many years after. And whenever we do meet, we remember ourselves with fond memories of those times. Thank you.
Anyone else? I think this people you look like you want to say.
Yeah, I'd like to also thank Anandi for writing the book and at least bringing members of the Sheffield and Birmingham one together after many years. It's great to see Raj and just there seeing. I think Mr. Can you stand up?
Yeah, that's right, Steve. But I think I want to commend Anandi for writing the book, doing the research, and I think, like Naeem says, it also depends the interpretation, the putting the historical jigsaw together depends upon the writer. So it's I only read the book last night very quickly, and there are a number of things which I think are important to raise. One is in terms of, no doubt the Asian youth movements were mainly Asian men. However, and as you've correctly said, in different cities, they respond to the local conditions and specificities. And in Sheffield, AYM, we did have some women members, particularly two women members, Alka and Jayshree. And the reason why I raised that, because the context and the kind of climate in which we operated was very male-dominated. And also where we met, initially used to meet in the Darwin Youth Club, then we used to meet later in life in restaurants, because restaurants were being attacked
Or we speak in the blues because we're trying to build unity with the Afro-Caribbean youth. Now, it's important that given those kind of conditions where women are involved in AYMs, that their involvement is even far more remarkable. And it's very sad if it's not acknowledged and recognised. And so that's one of the things I wanted to say, that in Sheffield, not only did you, and it was easier for those women because perhaps they were students and they came out of different cities to Sheffield, but also our sisters, my sisters were involved, and my good sisters were involved. And they tried to build within the A1 a women's kind of group. But by and large, the A1s, you're correct, were mainly male dominated. The other point was about the Bradford 12. The Bradford 12 really did galvanise a generation, and the self-defence issue was a really important issue. But the other lesson that we learned as Asian movements in the time was the issue of political adventurism, not substituting yourself for your community. So when the National Front was to come to Sheffield, what we did is the time before mobile phones. So the network, what we said was amongst taxi drivers and their radios, and we kind of mobilised the community, and our objective was for the community to defend itself. Similarly, when Jasbir talks about Northern Ireland and the political defence that we learned was about how in a local area when racist attacks were taking place, how we turned the victim into fighters, how we may mobilise the community with a picture of the area, we knocked on door to doors. We've got a picture of who was racist, who was anti-racist. We set telephone trees, and then when the conditions are ready, we would issue a press statement and say that if the powers that we did not come out to protect the family, then we had no choice but to defend them. So political defence is something that's really important. We also learned this from some of the left groups, LY, East London Workers Against Racism, because they were one group and we were sectarian. The AYMs, in terms of our politics, our blackness meant that anybody who was non-white, who was anti-imperialist, we would build broad fronts. We united with them, we had common fronts, and behind the black barricades, Iranians, Chileans, all of these organisations, all these communities inspired us, and we built lines with them. And secularism, the other issue that was raised, and I think this is my key point, we have Sikhs, we have Muslims, we have Hindus, we have Christians in the Asian youth movements. And we saw the rise, after the demise of AYMs, we saw the rise of identity politics, and after the Rushdie affair, we saw the rise of certain organisations. But even prior to that, in PWAs, Pakistani Work Association, we had fronts at universities. And there we saw the rise of Jamaatis coming into the UK, certain councillors in Birmingham, respect. We saw how they've been trained up. And so already we were challenging these forces in our communities. When we, as PWA, invited the trade unions for Pakistan, the meeting was threatened by Jamaatis. The meeting in Manchester was threatened by Jamaatis and stuff like that. So AYM secularism was very, very important to us. And and in the 90s, we challenged Al-Mazroon, Hizbut Tahrir in Manchester. Armour Rafiq got beaten up on Windsor Road, and they would come in their forces on Windsor Road trying to claim the streets. We were there. My colleagues, Jasbir, who was a Sikh, and the kind of abuse that was thrown at him for being a kafir, we could not tolerate that as coming from the tradition of the AYMs. So similarly, when it came to the anti-war movement in Birmingham, and then the reason I make this point is we were anti-imperialist, we were not anti-Western. And the mistake that certain comrades have made is that when we raise our voice against reactionary, backward, religious forces who organise our community, we somehow seem to be non-anti-imperialist. And the legacy of anti-imperialism in the AYMs is that we were anti-imperialist, but we also challenged organised religious forces in our community, be they Khalistanis or be they Jamaatis. And that's an important lesson which I think the book kind of glosses over slightly. And it's, other than that, I commend the book, and I think so the AYMs was possibly the largest grassroots mass movement, anti-racist movement in the South Asian community. And for that reason alone, it's something that we need to pass on to our kids, and it should be studied. And for that, I commend you for writing the book.
Well, yeah.
Is there a question? We're going to have one with the
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I think it's been a while. It's really nice to see all the old friends. They must be about 20 years seeing all these guys. But I just want to say that we were all in our 18, 19, 20 years of age at that time. And the 80s were a way that if things were happening, that you got radicalized in your politics. our starting point, I think I was involved in the Black Consciousness movement, the Black Consciousness group at the University at Sheffield. So it's the first time, I can remember the first time I read a book and suddenly realized that, up to that point, it was great living in the UK. And then suddenly you read this book where you say that the laws are racist, that you suddenly understand about racism and imperialism. So it's a starting point. And, in any struggle, when you're actually involved in that struggle, then you form bonds and you become radicalized. So the issue of Grant Patrol, New America, Unworthy Thought, we were all involved on those issues. And by taking part in those activities, we became radicalized, we formed links, and it was also an organizational point. And also, in relation to developing our politics, we didn't develop in isolation. We developed in relation to what was happening around us, whether it was the Revolutionary Communist Party or the Socialist Workers' Party and so on. So we had to have discussion with all of those and say that definitely there is a distinction. Because we'd heard about class struggle and that racism should be within that context. But in terms of our slogans, we always said that in terms of racism, whether it was Black Patrol or UA, that the struggle was about an attack on the black community. So our political statement has always been that we identify black as a political statement, whether you were Asian, whether you were brown, or whatever color that you identified yourself. And that's what radicalized us. And in terms of once you become radicalized and understand your own oppression within the society, then you can relate to struggles internationally, whether it's in India, whether it's in Africa, and so on. So on my personal journey, I ended up being radicalized and went to Maxwell Valley, so places like that. So it's a journey that you go through. And it was a point in time in the 80s when all of those things came together and you become radicalized. And I think hopefully, I'm glad somebody's actually written something about those. It's nice to have those memories again. And hopefully it will serve as an inspiration, because by studying that history, and when you look at universities and so on now, it's very, very sad that you see that a lot of the societies that you've got are not based on secularism, but they're based on religious societies and so on. And so this is what our youth that are going to university are faced with. And we need to have a defense and encourage this type of meetings and so on. Thanks very much.
Congratulations on the book. I haven't read it, I'm afraid yet, but on them. Just wanted to raise 2 points, I suppose. One was that you reflected on 2001 riots and said that many of the young people said about their parents, that talked about their parents as though they were still talking about their grandparents. And I wondered what your analysis of that was. So if the Asian youth movement was so entrenched in the community that third generation may still remember, is it just because it's not being documented, that history, or was there, to what extent was it a movement? So I suppose there's that question. And I suppose the second question is about the sexism stuff. Of course, the Asian movement, it wasn't a homogenous thing, it was regional, and yet it was a party movement. So in certain localities there were certain dynamics that actually were quite detrimental and harmful in not just personalities, but in sort of fragmenting movement and stuff. And I wondered to what extent, at what point, AYM might sort of reflect on that, to see what the lessons would be, in terms of
I just wanted to give my experience of Birmingham. came across these guys and thought these are rejects from universities coming up to try to breed some of the intellectual kind of ways of working to breed. I know obviously one of those people from Birmingham who was quite involved in some of the real, what I would call, the street rejection in terms of fighting some of the racism, in terms of fighting skinheadism and various other things. But it did give us some ways of really putting some perspective. Same as what I'm saying, that looking at books and saying, "Oh, you're right at times." I think there were people there. Something I certainly thought to myself. Yes, I knew where I was, and enhanced our network. I'm going to get a close friend of mine who died a year and a half ago. So I, came from the Bradford and came from the youth movement. And the real legacy, I would say, is that there was issues and there were strong personalities and a lot of differences in terms of state funding and all funding. And I remember one time I was vilified because I was a youth worker, working in a place where I was saying, well, we need to look at the new generation of people coming through. And people say, no, that's state associated. But the legacy is that, if you look at even the Pakistani or Kashmiri organizations, well-established organizations, that really got the intellect kind of compromising the thought that this is an anti-imperialism war that they're having. And even to this day, people, even one of the ex-prime ministers of in Kashmir, remember Syed so well, saying this guy, gave me some thought about where we were fighting, semi-colonialism, living in Kashmir. So in some senses, that contribution, I think, is phenomenal. And it is sad in some senses that even in 2001, that some of the older generation, even parents or uncles, were ringing people like me here in Birmingham saying, have you got any people in Bradford that we can get involved to mobilize, compared, because these sentences, 18 years or 12 years, is sort of atrocious. But unfortunately, that movement died, or say it wasn't as active as it should be. And we've got to look at the other contribution, is that some people, as life changes, they do progress, and unfortunately they go into, we've got, cabinet members from this local authority, who I thought we worked well for them to kind of, get that kind of thought that they will fight some real cause. But society has taken them over, and they've gone on, and they're the ones who for lavish receptions for really right-wing politicians or rather, it kills you, but it means that at least the legacy in terms of the positive contribution. The other one that I think we've both touched upon is the the Birmingham Black Sisters, if that's the right word, was an inspiration in terms of my sisters fighting an immigration case. And she could see some empathy that a Kashmiri woman who doesn't really speak that much English, but was saying that some women do, is aligned to some movement that she could inspire to mobilize other women on the streets to do that. And she actually, her, standing as a candidate was inspired, but saying that this has been around that. So I'm just not, unfortunately, with that, I think that probably some of those contributions wasn't recorded or was missed, and I hope that maybe another the second version could include some of those legacies that also.
I'm Popinder from Birmingham once, but it's great. I echo what others have said. One of the reasons I came here today was just that affection that we still have for the people who were with us on that struggle. And my 14-year-old a few months ago discovered some YouTube video with me in an uncompromising political position, to which he said, "Why don't you tell me about this? What did you do here?" It was rather like the white guy in the 50s and 60s who was asking his granddad what he did in the war. You know? And I believe one wonderful way to understand the experience of the Asian youth movements, the Black Sisters and others, was that we were the offspring of the first immigrants in that post-war period, mostly from the Indian subcontinent and the Caribbean communities, etc. And alongside that, we also had Roman Catholics in Ireland and the various struggles that would bring up. I've no doubt that it's a history whose story should be told and will be told. I know there were certain truths that the AYM often took the opportunity to force the left to hear, especially the left of the Labour Party. I remember my friend Thoric, on a number of occasions, would walk into a room and he'd say, well, they're all Labour Party, so I'll give them the old speech. And he'd come out and he'd say, talk about our analysis of immigration laws, for instance. He'd always say, and if you vote Labour, I can give you 100% guarantee, 100% guarantee that was true in 1968, it was true in the 80s, and it was true in 1999. And that 100% guarantee is the Conservatives can never create anything as punishing as the Labour Party in power when it comes to immigration laws. They created the Asylum and Immigration Act 1999. I remember being in a room with David Blunkett representing refugee organisations, and at one point I said to him, and this was the great leader of the Socialist Republic of Sheffield at one point, he turned around and said, this act, Bo, this will stop false asylum seekers and economic migrants. And I said, what will you do if you remove all these benefits and you leave them destitute with their children? Surely as a socialist you can't be that cruel. He had an answer. He would take the children away from the parents and put them into our social services institutions. And today,
humane socialist, yeah.
That's it. But today, as a direct consequence of that, and that's why I get some sadness when I very occasionally go to rooms like this where a lot of my left old Black Power colleagues are present. These days I tend to talk to Afghans, to Iraqis, to Kurds, to Somalis. And I'm reminded again that some of the other truths that the AYM learned, because there were some among us, quite a few. How many AYM members here are actually university graduates? There's quite a few of us. We were the first. We were the first. We were the cream of our mothers and fathers' children. We were the offspring. And when we found the reality in the universities, what was the reality we found? They created a pathology of our communities. They told us everything was generally analysable, and the way they analysed, we were the newcomers, and they controlled the world, and they explained why it was we were deficient, and we knew that meant nothing to us. We learnt their tricks, we passed their courses, we came home. And I'll never forget coming home to Birmingham in the 80s and reading Seven Anders, A Different Kind of Hunger. At last, I knew what the university hadn't given me. And the AYMs did.
So you
they
have your
gave
back
us new
towards
ideas.
us. So, but then you have your back towards
But
us.
what I would say is,
Yeah.
I'd encourage everybody in this room, if you're not a part of the refugee struggle in Britain today, join it. Because they need you. In our detention centres, women are raped, not once or twice or rarely, but regularly. Children are detained. If you want to know the horrors of what Fortress Europe aimed to create, you see it as the people come to Lampedusa. And the most horrible scene I read about recently was sent to me by a UN refugee guy, and he was amongst Italians taking the bodies out of the water. And they found one woman, and they thought, oh, she must have a rope attached to her. Her body was particularly difficult to move. It was an umbilical cord, and the fetus was in the stocking. And when 90 people died because they had no water in a desert, that was the fortress Europe that AYM was fighting against. And what I do say, absolutely, the story of chicken tikka and fish and chip shows that the AYMs, the Black Sisters, and the first generation, we breached the fortress. We're here to stay, and we're here to fight. But please, bring that fight. Join this struggle to the new struggles of refugee communities. The bourgeois intellectuals are already calling it super diversity, community cohesion. It mentions nothing of the images I've just mentioned. And that's why we have to return back to the refugee struggle.